You know, if I wanted to kill somebody, I'd take this book and beat you to death with it, and I wouldn't feel a thing. It'd be just like walking to the drugstore.
In popular conversation, whenever a cult is mentioned, it's customary for his name to be brought up by default. Even though the idea strayed far from that of typical religious-based cults like the People's Temple or Scientology, nowhere can the word cult be mentioned without being synonymously followed by the name Charles Manson, the Manson family. A counterculture commune fueled by sex and LSD set in the backdrop of the Summer of Love. The group boasted around 100 members at its peak, most of them young, wide-eyed, impressionable women from middle-class backgrounds who followed their charlatan prophet and Pied Piper into the desert hills surrounding Los Angeles. A handful of those loyal followers would follow their leader directly into infamy itself one hot summer night, committing some of the most violent and shocking crimes that America had ever seen. And a nation would be changed forever. But long before the groupies, the bloodshed, and the headlines, there was a man. A man who barely stood 5 feet tall with wild eyes and a crooked smile. Charles Miller Manson. And that name, much like many things in his early life, didn't come easy. Born November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio, to Kathleen Maddox, a rebellious teenage runaway and alcoholic, one could even say his entry into this life was full of falsehoods and contradictions. Extended family members reported that after running away from her typical and religious middle-class home in Ashland, Kentucky, the free-spirited Kathleen found work as a prostitute, but Kathleen would later say in a 1971 interview that she had never been a prostitute and that she had been just a dumb kid who had a child out of wedlock. The biological father abandoned the 15-year-old Kathleen before the child's birth and would have little to do with the family, according to some sources. This fact was later disputed by Kathleen herself, who claimed that Colonel Walker Scott, Manson's father, as well as a mill worker and reputed con artist, would be active in his son's life up until his death in 1954 from cancer. Quote, "All that stuff you read about Charles not knowing who his father was, that's not so. Scott used to come and pick up Charles and take him home for weekends with his own child. He just loved him," Maddox reported. She said her religious mother sent her away to Cincinnati to have the baby, along with her sister, and it was there that she would meet the man who would give her son his infamous last name, William Manson. She would accept his marriage proposal and they would wed when Kathleen, who had lied on her marriage license to claim she was 21, was 6 months pregnant. At first glance, it wouldn't seem that Kathleen was maternal material herself either, to the point that he wasn't even given a name on his birth. The name No Name Maddox was scrawled on the child's birth certificate. Kathleen would defend the decision to leave the child nameless and insisted that she wanted to wait for her mother to meet her in Cincinnati to properly name the child. Quote, "I figured I'd already hurt her pretty bad, so I wanted to let her name the baby, you see. So she named him after my father." Unquote. Weeks later, that child was renamed Charles Miller Manson. The choice to marry William would prove to be as ill-fated as previous relationships and wouldn't last long. Kathleen would go on long drinking sprees with her brother Luther and would leave young Charlie in the care of numerous babysitters. In 1937, William Manson would ultimately file for divorce from his troubled wife, citing gross neglect of duty. That same year, Kathleen would attempt to sue young Charlie's biological father for paternity. The suit was settled in court, but that wouldn't be the end of legal troubles for Kathleen. On August 1st, 1939, Kathleen and her brother Luther were both arrested for robbery and assault and were sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison, respectively, for robbing a gas station at gunpoint. Young Charlie was only 5 years old when the one constant adult presence in his life would be removed, and he would be sent to live with his mother's relatives in McMecken, West Virginia. Their home wasn't far from the West Virginia State Penitentiary at Moundsville, where his mother was serving her sentence. According to Charlie, it was an abusive and neglectful environment. But according to his cousin, Joanne, who lived with young Charlie in the home with his Aunt Glenna and Uncle Bill, the boy was nothing but trouble. From the outset, he would be caught in lies constantly and would blame others for anything he did wrong. Beginning in the first grade, in an eerie foreshadowing of future events, Manson would recruit gullible classmates, mostly girls, to attack other students that he didn't like. And after the violent outburst, Manson would claim innocence to his teachers, swearing that his pint-sized disciples were acting on their own free will, and he couldn't be held accountable for their actions. And because no one thought a 6-year-old capable of such complex Machiavellian manipulations, Charlie usually got off scot-free, while his followers bore the brunt of punishment. Though his dirty deeds weren't simply confined to the manipulation of others, when he felt personally slighted or insulted, he would turn violent himself. He was fascinated with guns, knives, and anything sharp, and in a telling account, his cousin Joanne would recount a frightening close encounter with young Charlie and his fascination with weapons. One afternoon, Joanne recalled that her parents had gone out and had told her to change the bed linens and to watch Charlie. Charlie would always ignore household chores, so instead of trying to get him to help her with the task, Joanne would send Charlie out into the yard to play, while she changed the linen in one of the bedrooms. Soon, Charlie came skipping back inside, brandishing a razor-sharp sickle that he'd found in the yard. He menacingly waved it in Joanne's face, but being bigger and older than her scrawny cousin, she easily pushed him aside and continued tucking in the sheets. Charlie then jumped between her and the bed, still holding the weapon. Frustrated, Joanne shoved Charlie outside and locked the screen door behind him. She thought that was the end of it, but something inside Charlie snapped. He began shrieking and slashing at the screen door with the sickle. She said there was a crazy look on his face, and she had no doubt that he intended to kill her once he got back inside. He had torn through the screen door and was wrenching the door open when Bill and Glenna Thomas returned home. They took one look at the destroyed screen door, then at Charlie's red, furious face and Joanne's pale, frightened one, and asked what had happened. So terrified she could barely speak, Joanne muttered, "Ask Charles." Charlie attempted to spin the narrative that Joanne had attacked him, and he was simply defending himself. Bill and Glenna didn't believe him and gave him a whipping. Charles Manson was only 7 years old. His mother would be paroled in 1942, and Manson would later characterize the first few weeks after she returned from prison as the happiest in his life. They would live in a variety of hotel rooms across the years before finally settling down in Charleston, West Virginia. Manson was constantly truant from school and involved in petty crime, claiming once in an interview with Diane Sawyer that he had set fire to his school when he was 9, while Kathleen, either unwilling or unable to control her son, spent her evenings drinking. She would continue to struggle with legal troubles, being arrested once for grand larceny, but not convicted. It was during these years that Manson would make dubious claims about his own mother, claiming she once tried to sell him for a pitcher of beer. And yet, on the other hand, he would also defend her in his autobiography, Manson, in his own words. Quote, "Other writers have portrayed Mom as a teenage whore. Because she happened to be the mother of Charles Manson, she is downgraded. I prefer to think of her as a flower child in the 30s, 30 years ahead of her times." Unquote. All of these contradicting details make the story of Manson's early life complicated to unwind in order to separate the truth from rumors. It also didn't help that Manson himself was known to be a compulsive liar. But facts remain facts. and the fact became clear that after the family's relocation to Indianapolis and meeting her second husband from attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, dealing with the preteen Manson became too much for Kathleen to handle, and she would send young Charlie to a Catholic reform school when he was 12 years old. The Gabalt School for Boys in Terre Haute, Indiana was a strict institution. Any infraction or transgression would be corrected by physical punishment via a wooden paddle or a leather strap. Manson would eventually run away from the school and hide himself in the woods before fleeing home to his mother. He would spend Christmas in 1947 at his aunt and uncle's house in McMecken before his mother would eventually return him to Gabalt. The return to the stringent corrective environment wouldn't be permanent. 10 months later, he would escape again and run away to Indianapolis, where he committed his first known crime in 1948 when he robbed a grocery store. At first, the robbery was solely to steal some food to eat, but Manson also discovered a cigar box containing over $100. He would steal the money too and use the funds to rent himself a room on Skid Row in Indianapolis and to buy himself food. For a brief period of time, while in the city living on his own, Manson appeared to attempt to go straight. He got a job with Western Union as a courier and made money delivering messages. The legal income wasn't satisfactory for Charlie, and he began to supplement his income with petty theft. Eventually, he would run afoul of the law and get caught, ending up in front of a sympathetic judge who would send him to Boys Town in Omaha, Nebraska in 1949. After a mere 4 days at the juvenile facility, he and a fellow student named Blackie Nielsen would somehow obtain a gun and steal a car. They would go on the run, heading back towards Peoria, Illinois, where Nielsen's uncle lived. While on the road, they would rob a gas station and another business at gunpoint. When they arrived in Peoria, they met up with Nielsen's uncle, who was also a thief, and took the boys on as apprentices. Manson was ultimately arrested 2 weeks later during a nighttime raid of a shop. He was quickly connected to the 2 prior armed robberies and was sent to the strict Indiana Boys School, yet another reform institution for minors. The school proved a bleak and abusive environment where violence would continue to set the pattern that Manson would become familiar with for the rest of his institutionalized life. While at the school, allegedly Manson was raped by other students at the encouragement of a staff member and was beaten repeatedly. He ran away from the school a total of 18 times. It was while he was in attendance at the Indiana Boys School that he began to further hone his techniques of psychological manipulation. He developed a self-defense method that he referred to as the insane game, where if he found himself at a physical disadvantage and unable to defend himself, he would scream and flail his arms while making strange faces in order to try to convince his attackers that he was crazy. After many failed escape attempts, he would finally successfully escape with 2 other boys in February 1951. The 3 stole cars and tried to make a fugitive flight to California, but old habits seemed to die hard, and on the way they robbed several gas stations. The escape attempt would come to a premature end when the trio were eventually arrested in Utah. This crime spree would differ distinctly from other escapes and flights made from correctional facilities, though, because of one seminal thing. The act of stealing a car and crossing state lines was considered a federal crime. For this, Manson was sent to the National Training School for Boys in Washington, D.C. On his arrival at the facility, he was given aptitude tests that showed he was illiterate but had an above-average IQ of 109. His caseworker also deemed him to be aggressively antisocial. At a psychiatrist's recommendation, he was relocated in October of 1951 to a minimum security institution called National Bridge Honor Camp. His aunt would visit him and said that on his release he would have a place to live with her and that she would help him find work. However, his parole hearing that was set for February of 1952 was derailed when he was caught in January raping a boy at knife point. Manson would be transferred to the Federal Reformatory in Petersburg, Virginia. But even a change in venue would not curb Manson's violent impulses. While at the Federal Reformatory, he committed a further, quote, 8 serious disciplinary offenses, including 3 homosexual acts. This was the last act of grace given to the young Manson, who would then be transferred to a maximum security reformatory at Chillicothe, Ohio, where he was expected to remain until his release on his 21st birthday in November 1955. Surprisingly, though, a streak of good behavior would lead to his early release in May of 1954 to his aunt and uncle's custody. It was a brief, placid eye in the storm that would not last. In January of 1955, Manson would marry a hospital waitress, 15-year-old Rosalie Jean Willis. Around October, he would revert to his old ways and steal a car to drive himself and his then-pregnant wife from Ohio to Los Angeles. About 3 months after their illicit arrival, the law would catch up with Manson and he would yet again be charged with the federal crime of taking a stolen vehicle across state lines. After a psychiatric evaluation, he was given 5 years probation but was ordered to appear in a Los Angeles court for an identical charge from Florida. He failed to appear. His probation was summarily revoked and he was sentenced to 3 years in prison at Terminal Island in San Pedro, California. While he was in prison, his wife would give birth to his firstborn son, Charles Manson Jr. His mother, Kathleen, had moved to California to live with Rosalie and her grandson to be close to the small family, but the peace wouldn't last. Eventually, Rosalie stopped visiting Manson in prison, and his mother informed him in March of 1957 that his wife was living with another man. Enraged and determined to act, less than 2 weeks before a scheduled parole hearing, Manson attempted to escape by yet again stealing a car. His parole was denied, and he was placed on 5 years probation. In September of 1958, Rosalie would be granted a petition for divorce the same year that Charlie would be granted 5 years parole from prison, and he quickly took full advantage of his newly granted freedom. By November, he was pimping out a 16-year-old girl while receiving additional financial support from another girl with wealthy parents. The strange power over the women in his life and his ability to manipulate them to his will would continue to follow him until 2 violent nights in the serene Hollywood Hills, when the world would turn upside down. In September of 1958, he would plead guilty to attempting to cash a forged U.S. Treasury check. He received a 10-year suspended sentence and probation after a woman named Leona, who had a checkered past of prostitution, tearfully pled that she and Manson were, quote, deeply in love and would marry Charlie if he were freed. By the end of the year, she would follow through with the marriage, likely also so she would not be compelled to testify against her new husband, as forcing a wife to do so is prohibited by law. Manson would take his new bride and another woman to New Mexico for the purposes of prostitution, which quickly resulted in him being questioned for violating the Mann Act, a federal law that prohibited the crossing of state lines with any woman or girl for the purpose of prostitution or lewd acts. In essence, early human trafficking laws. He would be released, but Manson suspected that the investigation wasn't over, and it wouldn't be the last he would hear from the authorities on that matter. And he was right. After he disappeared and failed to report to his probation officer, a bench warrant was issued for his arrest. An indictment for a violation of the Mann Act quickly followed in June of 1960. Manson was arrested in Laredo, Texas, following the apprehension of one of the women in his company for prostitution, and he was returned to Los Angeles to face the music. For violating his probation on the original check fraud charge, he was ordered to serve out his 10-year sentence. He spent a year fighting the revocation of his probation. In July of 1961, he was transferred to the penitentiary at McNeil Island. It was while incarcerated here that Manson would begin the musical journey that would end with 7 people dead. Manson always loved music and began taking guitar lessons while at McNeil from the leader of the legendary Barker Karpus gang, Alvin "Creepy" Karpus. Manson wanted to become a professional singer-songwriter, and fellow inmate and record producer Phil Kaufman recalled once that when a guard taunted Manson about never getting out, Manson very calmly looked up from his guitar and said, "Get out of where?" Kaufman recalled that while he thought Manson was a subpar guitar player, that he was capable enough as a singer and songwriter, and that he stood a good chance of getting a record contract. Kaufman shared the name of a friend in the film industry with Manson before his release, Gary Stromberg at Universal Studios. This wasn't the only odd Hollywood connection that Manson would encounter while incarcerated. While at the Los Angeles County Jail before being transferred to McNeil, he would meet future film star Danny Trejo while he was only 17 years old. It was also during this time that Charles Manson would be introduced to another element of the Hollywood lifestyle, the Church of Scientology. He declared himself a member at one point during his incarceration in the early 60s after he had reportedly been dabbling in many religions, but found Scientology appealing because of its mind control tactics. He was introduced to the religion by a cellmate who guided him through the courses, but after about 150 hours of the auditing process, would eventually fall out of the religion and never become an active member. Rumors swirled around after his conviction in the Tate killings that Manson had backed out of the religion after reportedly reaching OT5 because it proved, quote, too crazy for him. But the likely truth of it is that Manson ultimately got what he wanted out of the process, picking up mind control techniques that he would use later in his own followers, and quit when it proved no longer useful to his goals. Still, it's a fun idea to think that a religion existed that was even too extreme for Charles Manson. During his incarceration at McNeil Island, his mother Kathleen would move to Washington and take a job as a waitress in a nearby town to be closer to her son. But a mother's attentive love would come too little too late to correct his long-developed negative and sociopathic behavior patterns. In a 1961 annual review at the prison, it was observed that Manson had a, quote, tremendous drive to call attention to himself, and this was echoed in a 1964 review as well. In 1963, Manson's second wife, Leona, would be granted a divorce, and during the process would claim that the pair had a son together, Charles Luther. Manson would remain at McNeil Island until June of 1966, when he would be sent to Terminal Island a second time to prepare for an early release. By the time of his actual release on March 21, 1967, 32-year-old Charles Manson had spent more than half of his life in prisons and institutions. He told the authorities that prison had become his home and requested to stay, stating that he couldn't make it in the outside world and that he would only end up behind bars again eventually. He was right. Following his release from prison, Manson moved into an apartment in Berkeley, California, and soon became acquainted with 23-year-old library assistant Mary Brunner. According to a secondhand account, it didn't take long for Manson to snare Brunner in his thrall and to overcome her resistance to his bringing other women home to live with the couple. Before long, they were sharing Brunner's residence with 18 women. Brunner would eventually become pregnant with Manson's third child. Manson had set himself up as something of a guru in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district, and he would soon have his group of followers, mostly troubled young women seeking either adventure during the fabled summer of love, or seeking purpose and escape from a disaffected middle-class existence. Before the summer was over, Manson and the women hit the road in a bus decked out in psychedelic style, traveling down to Los Angeles into the Topanga Canyon and Venice Beach areas. While the group grew and fluctuated to as many as more than 100 members at its peak, there was always a singular core group of loyal members, some of whom would follow Charles Manson directly into infamy. The core members were Charles Tex Watson, Robert Beausoleil, Mary Brunner, Linda Kasabian, Patricia Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, and Leslie Van Houten. Though in all the busking, begging, and rambling of the ideal flower child lifestyle that the group found themselves living in, Manson had never given up on the idea of becoming a famous musician. And while nothing had come of the audition that Phil Kaufman had attempted to set up for Manson at Universal Studios due to his ill-preparedness and amateur showing, he was determined to ingratiate his way into fame at the first opportunity. That opportunity presented itself in the form of internationally famous Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson. Dennis Wilson was living in Los Angeles when he picked up Manson family members Patricia Krenwinkel and Ella Jo Bailey while they were hitchhiking. While under the influence of alcohol and LSD, he drove them back to his Pacific Palisades home where they stayed for a few hours. He left alone in the evening for a nighttime recording session, and when he arrived back home in the early hours of the morning, he found Manson emerging from the house and in the driveway. Wilson asked the scraggly stranger if he intended to harm him. Manson said he had no such intention and started kissing Wilson's feet. Inside the house, Wilson discovered 12 strangers, mostly women. Stories vary on how the pair actually met, but one thing is certain: the expenses and pure havoc wreaked by the commune that had taken over Wilson's home. The amount of women living in the home would double over the next few months, and they cost him an approximate $100,000 by making themselves a part of his household. This included a large medical bill for their treatments for gonorrhea, and $21,000 for the destruction of Wilson's uninsured vehicle that they had borrowed. Wilson would sing and talk with Manson while the women were instructed to serve them both. Wilson paid for studio time to record songs that Manson wrote and introduced him to industry connections like Greg Jacobson, Rudy Altobelli, and Terry Melcher. According to Manson, he took part in a, quote, pretty fair session, putting down about 10 songs at Brian's home studio. Beach Boys band manager Nick Grillo expanded on this, stating that there were approximately 100 hours of Manson's music recorded at that studio. In 1971, Beach Boys member Mike Love told Rolling Stone magazine that the band still possessed, quote, several 8-track tapes of Charlie and the Girls that Dennis cut. In former Los Angeles prosecutor and district attorney Vincent Bugliosi's 1974 book about the Manson murders, Helter Skelter, he reported that Dennis claimed to have destroyed the tapes because, quote, the vibrations connected with them don't belong on this earth, unquote. The closest Manson ever actually got to fame was a dubious event. An altered version of one of Manson's songs did actually make it onto a released Beach Boys album. In December of 1968, the group released the single Bluebirds Over the Mountain, and on the B-side of the single was a song credited to Dennis Wilson called Never Learn Not to Love. But the song was actually a reworking of a song Manson wrote specifically for the Beach Boys to record called Cease to Exist. Manson claimed he wrote it in response to the tension he witnessed between Dennis and his brothers and bandmates Carl and Brian Wilson. He demoed it to be played on acoustic guitar, but the band ended up changing some of the music by expanding the arrangement and structure, adding vocal harmonies and another bridge. The lyrics were also altered, which reportedly infuriated Manson. Dennis Wilson, for his part, claimed that Manson voluntarily exchanged his writing credit on the song for a lump sum of cash and a motorcycle, but Manson remained incensed by the change in his lyrics, and this would begin a rift between the two. Some would even claim that it was this event, coupled with Terry Melcher's dismissal of Manson and the idea of recording or producing any of his music, was the catalyst to the horrors that would soon take place. Eventually, Wilson would move out of his rented home in order to detach himself from Manson and the women who had become such a negative influence on his life, and his landlord would evict the family. Once evicted from the home, the family needed a new place to live, and Manson would eventually settle the group at Spawn Ranch in August of 1968. The ranch had been used as a TV and movie set for various westerns, but the buildings had fallen into disrepair, and the main income of the ranch in the late 1960s was derived from selling horseback rides. Family members would do chores and construction around the ranch, and the women occasionally had sex on Manson's command with the nearly blind 80-year-old owner, George Spahn. The women would cook for him and also act as his seeing eye guides. In exchange, Spahn allowed Manson and the group to live at the ranch for free. Infamous member and attempted presidential assassin Lynette Fromme would get her nickname Squeaky while at the ranch because she often squeaked when Spahn pinched her thigh. Charles Watson, a small-town Texas youth who had quit college and moved to California, also gained his nickname at the ranch. He met Manson at Wilson's home after giving Wilson a ride when his car was wrecked. George Spahn nicknamed Watson Tex because of his pronounced Texas drawl. But nicknames aside, Charles Manson had his taste of fame and the celebrity high life, and now that Dennis Wilson had cut him off, he was determined not to be shut out of the elite inner circles he craved the money and attention of. His paranoia was growing, and he soon became fixated on the idea that the world would be ending as the result of an apocalyptic race war between whites and blacks, which he dubbed Helter Skelter, after the Beatles song of the same name. Manson was obsessed with the song and claimed it contained hidden messages, when in fact it was actually, according to songwriters John Lennon and Paul McCartney, about an old carnival ride. An avowed white supremacist, Manson was seeing racial conspiracy everywhere. He prophesied to his family members that the end times were coming and that they would be the only ones to survive the chaos. He claimed that black people in America would rise up and kill all whites except for Manson and his family, but that they were not intelligent enough to survive on their own, that they would need a white man to lead them, and so they would serve Manson as their master. These notions, fueled by the rage of being ousted from high society, as well as hallucinogens and other drugs, would bend members to Manson's vision, and soon they were ready to act on his violent impulses. Gary Allen Hinman was a music teacher and postgraduate student at UCLA. At some point in the late 1960s, he befriended members of the Manson family, allowing some to occasionally stay in his home. Believing that he was wealthy, Manson sent family members Bobby Beausoleil, Mary Brunner, and Susan Atkins to Hinman's home on July 25, 1969, to convince him to join the family and to turn over the assets that Manson thought Hinman had inherited. The three individuals held the uncooperative Hinman hostage for 2 days, during which time Manson arrived with a sword and slashed his ear. After that, Beausoleil stabbed Hinman to death, allegedly on Manson's instruction. Before leaving the Topanga Canyon residence, Beausoleil or one of the women used Hinman's blood to write "Political Piggy" on the wall and to draw a panther paw, a Black Panther symbol, in an attempt to implicate the group for the crime in order to spark the race war that Manson had predicted was going to end the world. In magazine interviews following his arrest, Bobby Beausoleil claimed that he went to Hinman's to get his money back for a batch of bad drugs that Hinman had sold to him. He added that Brunner and Atkins were unaware of his intent and went along merely to visit Hinman. Atkins contradicted this account in her 1977 autobiography, where she wrote that Manson directly told Beausoleil, Brunner, and her to go up to Hinman's and supposedly get the inheritance of $21,000. She said that 2 days earlier, Manson had told her privately that if she wanted to, quote, do something important, she could kill Hinman and get his money. Beausoleil was arrested on August 6, 1969, after he was caught driving Hinman's car. Police found the murder weapon in the tire well. But this was only a prelude to the final act. On August 8, 1969, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Linda Kasabian, and Patricia Krenwinkel went to the house at 10050 Cielo Drive. Manson had instructed the women to do as Watson instructed them, which was to, quote, totally destroy everyone in it, as gruesome as you can. The house had once belonged to record producer Terry Melcher and his then-girlfriend Candice Bergen. Manson had run afoul of Melcher during his short-lived and ill-fated music career. Manson felt that Melcher had snubbed him and sought vengeance. He, nor did the rest of the family, realize that Melcher, at the urging of his mother Doris Day, had moved out and rented the house to director Roman Polanski and his wife, actress Sharon Tate. Though supposedly, at one point, according to another account, Manson showed up months prior to the home on Cielo Drive looking for Melcher, he was turned away by the groundskeeper who told him that Melcher no longer lived there, while Tate was present. When the group arrived at the entrance to the property, Watson, who had been there before, climbed a telephone pole near the gate and cut the phone lines to the house. The unaware partygoers inside the home were officially cut off from help. It was now past midnight, August 9th, 1969. The group moved their car to the bottom of a hill that led up to the estate, parked, and walked up back toward the house. Hesitant to enter via the front gate, feeling that it may have been electrocuted or armed with an alarm, they instead climbed up an embankment to the right of the gate and entered the grounds. It was then that headlights approached from further back within the property, coming along the angled drive. Tex Watson ordered the three women to hide in the bushes while he stepped out to flag the driver down. The driver of the car was Stephen Parent, 18 years old. He had been visiting the caretaker of the grounds, William Garretson, who lived in a separate guest house on the estate. Watson pointed a .22 caliber revolver at Parent when he stopped the car. The frightened teen begged for his life, telling Watson he wouldn't say anything about seeing him on the property. Watson then pulled out a knife and slashed at Parent, cutting him across the palm deep enough to sever tendons. He ripped Parent's watch off his wrist before leveling the pistol and shooting the youth 4 times in the chest and abdomen, killing him. Watson then ordered the women to come out from hiding and help him push Parent's AMC ambassador further up the driveway towards the gate. While the women moved the car, Watson surveyed the front of the house, seeking an entry through an open window to the main home. He discovered an available window and cut the screen. It was at this time that he ordered Kasabian to keep lookout down by the main gate. Watson entered through the cut screen, then let Atkins and Krenwinkel in through the front door of the home. The party that Sharon Tate had been having with some of her closest friends had been winding down. In attendance was Jay Sebring, a famed hairdresser and former boyfriend of Tate, Wojciech Frykowski, who was Polanski's friend and an aspiring screenwriter. Frykowski's girlfriend, Abigail Folger, heiress to the Folger coffee fortune, was also at the home. Polanski was in Europe filming, and while Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant at the time, had been with him on the shoot, she had returned to LA 3 weeks early. Frykowski was asleep on the couch when the 3 assailants entered the home. He awoke upon hearing Watson whisper to Atkins. Watson noticed the movement and kicked Frykowski in the head. When Frykowski asked Watson who he was and what he was doing in the house, he infamously said,
"I am the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business."
Under Watson's direction, Atkins located the other 3 occupants in the house and with Krenwinkel's assistance forced them into the living room. Watson began to tie Sebring and Tate together by the necks with the rope he had brought, slinging the rope over one of the high ceiling beams of the house like a makeshift noose. Sebring began to protest about the rough treatment of the heavily pregnant Tate, which prompted an angry Watson to shoot him. Abigail Folger was led back to her bedroom for her purse, from which she gave the intruders $70. While Folger was in the back room, Watson pulled his knife and stabbed the injured and groaning Sebring 7 times. Frykowski had been bound by the hands with a simple towel. He managed to free himself and began to struggle with Atkins. She stabbed at his legs with the knife she had been using to guard him as he fled. He fought his way out of the front door and onto the porch, but Watson managed to catch up with him. He struck Frykowski over the head several times with the gun, breaking the right grip. Frykowski was stabbed repeatedly and shot twice. Around this time, Kasabian had come up the driveway, drawn by, quote, horrifying sounds. She arrived outside the front door, and in a vain attempt to halt the massacre, she lied to Atkins, telling her that someone was coming. Meanwhile, inside the house, Folger had escaped from Krenwinkel and fled out of a bedroom door to the pool area. Folger was pursued all the way around to the front lawn by Krenwinkel, who caught her, stabbed her, and tackled her to the ground. She was then dealt the death blow by the waiting Watson and Krenwinkel, who together stabbed her 28 times. Her chilling last words were supposedly, "You can stop now. I'm already dead." Frykowski, who was still clinging to life, attempted to drag himself across the lawn in search of escape. Watson caught up with the injured man and in a violent flurry of attacks finished him off with a knife. Frykowski was stabbed a total of 51 times. Inside the house, Tate pleaded to be let go, offering herself as a hostage in an effort to save her unborn child. Please don't kill me. I don't want to die. I just want to have my baby." "Look, bitch, I don't care a thing about you. You're going to die, and there's nothing you can do about it," was the response that Susan Atkins gave to Tate's pleas. Atkins would initially testify in court to stabbing Tate herself, but would later recant this testimony, claiming in fact that Watson had done the deed. In a 1978 autobiography, Watson would claim that he stabbed Tate and Atkins never touched her. He would claim that he falsely claimed innocence at the time of the stabbing because prosecutors were convinced that Atkins had been the one. While the actual perpetrator is unclear, Atkins, Watson, or both, two facts are certain. Sharon Tate was stabbed 16 times while she cried for her mother. Manson's orders had been carried out, and earlier, before the group had left the Spawn Ranch, Manson told the women to, quote, "leave a sign, something witchy." Using the towel that had bound Frykowski's hands, Atkins wrote the word "pig" on the house's front door in Tate's blood. The following night, a similar terror and madness would be wreaked against two more unsuspecting victims, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, at 3301 Waverly Drive. The home at 3301 Waverly Drive was Leno's childhood home. The pair, who had been married 9 years, were on their way back from dropping Rosemary's daughter Susan at her apartment. On the way, they stopped to get gas. Making a U-turn, they picked up a copy of the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner from John Falcano's newsstand across the street. Leno had been a regular of Falcano's, and they stood talking for a few minutes about the news of the day, including the Tate murders that had occurred the previous night. Rosemary seemed unnerved by the killings. He recalls the LaBiancas leaving around 1 or 2 a.m. Unlike the Tate murders the night before, Manson was actually present for these murders, albeit very briefly. He had been displeased by the panic of the victims at Cielo Drive the night before. Manson accompanied Leslie Van Houten, Steve Clem Grogan, and the 4 family members from the previous night to, quote, "show them how to do it." Manson and Tex Watson were the first to enter the house. They subdued the sleeping couple by promising them that no harm would come to them if they complied with their attackers' demands. They were only here to rob them. With Rosemary and Leno in the living room, pillowcases over their heads held in place by lamp cords, Manson exited the house. He instructed the girls waiting in the car outside, Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten, to enter the house and murder the inhabitants. The women went inside and went to the kitchen in search of weapons. Watson then sent the women from the kitchen to the bedroom where Rosemary had been relocated. Watson returned to the living room and stood watch over Leno. Leno LaBianca seemed hesitant to believe the promise of these scraggly, dirty intruders. He began to struggle with Watson, who promptly stabbed him in the throat with a chrome-plated bayonet. "Don't stab me anymore," Leno pleaded. Then, in an eerie echo of Abigail Folger's last words, he said, "I'm dead. I'm dead." Back in the bedroom, Rosemary undoubtedly heard the struggle between Watson and her husband. She began to fight back against Van Houten and Krenwinkel, swinging the lamp that she had tied around her neck at her attackers. Krenwinkel was perturbed by the victim's defiance and threatened Rosemary with one of the knives that they had retrieved from the kitchen. Rosemary began pleading for her life, saying that they could have anything they wanted and she wouldn't call the police. The mention of the police seemed to trigger an already agitated Van Houten, who held Rosemary down while Patricia Krenwinkel stabbed her in the neck. But in the frenzy, the knife bent. The women called to Watson for help. He came to the bedroom and stabbed Rosemary a few times with the bayonet. Van Houten recalled in later testimony that Watson gave her a knife as well. She said, quote, "I stabbed Mrs. LaBianca in the lower torso. I knew I needed to do something," unquote. Van Houten stabbed Rosemary in the back and the exposed buttocks 16 times. Watson reportedly was instructed to make certain that each family member had an equal role in the killing. At the end of the bloody struggle, Rosemary LaBianca had been stabbed a total of 41 times. Using the blood of their victims, just like they had at the Tate murders, they wrote "Rise" and "Death to Pigs" on the walls, and, perhaps most famously, misspelled the words "Helter Skelter" on the refrigerator door, the song from the Beatles' White Album that Manson had become obsessed with. Krenwinkel did most of the writing. She also punctured Leno 14 times with an ivory-handled carving fork, which she left sticking out of his stomach. She also left a steak knife jutting from his throat. The killers then showered in the home, pet the LaBianca's dogs, then left. Meanwhile, Manson, who had been outside during the killings, got in the car with getaway driver Linda Kasabian. He handed her Rosemary's wallet and told her to drop it on the sidewalk as soon as they arrived at a black neighborhood. According to prosecutors, Manson wanted a black person to find the wallet and use the credit cards so the police would think they found the real killer. But on the way, there was a change of plans. Manson had Kasabian pull into a gas station in Sylmar, 20 miles northwest of the LaBianca home. He asked her to leave it in the women's restroom. She didn't just leave it, though. Instead, she hid it in the toilet tank. The wallet wouldn't be found for another 4 months. The next day, the LaBianca children discovered the dead bodies of their parents. Leno was on the living room floor with a bloody pillowcase covering his head. A cord was tied around his neck, and his hands were behind his back, tied with a leather strap. He had been stabbed a total of 12 times with the bayonet. One of the perpetrators had also carved the word "war" on Leno's exposed abdomen. Rosemary was on the bedroom floor, wearing one of her favorite blue and white striped dresses, which was bunched up over her head, exposing her naked body. But well before the LaBiancas suffered a night of terror in their home at the hands of the Manson family, the wheels of justice had already begun to turn. The Tate murders had become national news on August 9, 1969. The Polanski's housekeeper, Winifred Chapman, had arrived for work that morning and discovered the murder scene. On August 10th, detectives of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, which had jurisdiction in the Hinman case, informed LAPD detectives assigned to the Tate case of the bloody writing that had also been found at the Hinman house. According to Manson prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi, because detectives believed the Tate murders were a consequence of a drug transaction, the Tate team ignored this and the crime's other similarities. The Tate autopsies were underway, and the LaBianca bodies were yet to be discovered. During the Tate autopsies, detectives working on the Gary Hinman case noticed the similarities in the weapons used, the stab wounds, and the writing in blood on the walls. They also thought that the case had something to do with narcotics. They brought the information to detectives working on the Tate murders, but they had no official suspects outside of groundskeeper William Garretson, whom victim Stephen Parent had been meeting the night of the murders. Held briefly as a Tate suspect, Garretson told police that he had neither seen nor heard anything on the night of the murder. He was released on August 11, 1969, after undergoing a polygraph examination that indicated he had not been involved in the crimes. Interviewed decades later, he stated he had, in fact, witnessed a portion of the murders, as the examination suggested. Garretson died in August 2016. The LaBianca crime scene was discovered at about 10:30 p.m. on August 10th, approximately 19 hours after the murders were committed. 15-year-old Frank Struthers, Rosemary's son from a prior marriage and Leno's stepson, returned from a camping trip and was disturbed by seeing all of the window shades of his home drawn and the fact that his stepfather's speedboat was still attached to the family car, which was parked in the driveway. He called his older sister and her boyfriend. The boyfriend, Joe Dorgan, accompanied by the younger Struthers into the home and discovered Leno's body. Rosemary's body was found by investigating police officers. On August 12, 1969, the LAPD told the press that it had ruled out any connection between the LaBianca homicides and the Tate homicides. On August 16th, the sheriff's office raided Spahn Ranch and arrested Manson and 25 others as, quote, suspects in a major auto theft ring that had been stealing Volkswagen Beetles and converting them into dune buggies. Weapons were seized, but because the warrant had been misdated, the group was released a few days later. In a report at the end of August, the LaBianca detectives noted a possible connection between the bloody writings at the LaBianca house and the, quote, singing group The Beatles' most recent album. Still working separately from the Tate team, the LaBianca team checked with the sheriff's office in mid-October about possible similar crimes. It was then that they learned of the Hinman case. They also learned that the Hinman detectives had spoken with Beausoleil's girlfriend, Kitty Lutzinger. She had been arrested a few days earlier with members of the Manson family. Following up on leads a month after they had spoken with Lutzinger, LaBianca detectives contacted members of a motorcycle gang that Manson had tried to enlist as his bodyguards while the family was at Spahn Ranch. While the gang members were providing information that suggested a link between Manson and the murders, a dormitory mate of Susan Atkins informed the LAPD of the family's involvement in the crimes. Atkins was booked for the Hinman murder after she told sheriff's detectives that she had been involved in it. Transferred to Sybil Brand Institute, a detention center in Monterey Park, California, she had begun bragging to bunkmates Ronnie Howard and Virginia Graham details of the Tate and LaBianca murders. Details that only someone who had been present at the crime scenes would know. On December 1st, acting on information from these sources, the LAPD announced arrest warrants for Watson, Kasabian, and Krenwinkel for the Tate case. Manson and Atkins were not mentioned as they were already in custody at the time. Meanwhile, physical evidence was being gathered from the crime scenes, such as Krenwinkel and Watson's fingerprints around the house at Cielo Drive, not to mention the .22 caliber pistol that Watson had used to shoot victim Stephen Parent. The pistol had been discovered by a 10-year-old neighbor of the Tate Polanski residence, and he had turned the weapon over to the authorities. Bloody clothing discarded by the assailants was also discovered by a local ABC television crew, not to mention a knife lost by Susan Atkins at the Tate crime scene, ultimately discovered behind a cushion. With the evidence piling up, the trial began on June 15, 1970. Since Linda Kasabian had not actively participated in the murders, she was offered immunity to testify against other family members regarding the crimes committed that terrible night. Manson, Atkins, Kasabian, and Krenwinkel were charged with 7 counts of murder and 1 of conspiracy. Tex Watson fled back to Texas following the murders and was arrested there on November 30th, 1969. He fought extradition long enough to be tried separately from the other defendants, but would ultimately face the same charges. Leslie Van Houten, who had only participated in the LaBianca killings, was charged with 2 counts of murder and 1 of conspiracy. Manson was originally granted permission by Judge William Keene to act as his own attorney during the course of the trial, but due to his strange behavior, including a violation of a gag order, this permission was withdrawn before the trial began. On Friday, July 24th, the first day of testimony, Manson appeared in court with an X famously carved into his own forehead. The reason for this, in his own words, was because he was, quote, considered inadequate and incompetent to speak or defend himself, and had X'd himself from the establishment's world. Over the following weekend, the female defendants in the case would duplicate the mark on their own foreheads, as did most family members within a day or so. During the trial, other family members would loiter outside of the courthouse and in the hallways, causing a constant disruptive presence during proceedings. Most were forced to remain outside, where they would participate in vigils or walk around brandishing sheathed hunting knives, each identifiable by the X mark on their foreheads. Some family members would even go to the extent of attempting to dissuade witnesses from testifying. Several were threatened, and one was injured in a suspicious fire when his van burned. Former member Barbara Hoyt, who had overheard Susan Atkins describing the Tate murders to family member Ruth Ann Morehouse, spoke of being drugged by Morehouse with a heaping dose of LSD in her food in an attempt to keep her from being called as a witness or from testifying. It had the opposite effect. Where she had been a reluctant witness before the drugging incident, afterwards her reticence disappeared, and while in the hospital recovering from being drugged, made it clear that she wished to testify to what she had been told. On October 5th, Manson himself was denied permission by the court to question a prosecution witness whom his own defense attorneys had declined to cross-examine. In a violent outburst, Manson leapt over the defense table and attempted to attack the judge. He was wrestled to the ground by bailiffs and removed from the court, followed by the female defendants in the case, all who had risen and began chanting in Latin. After that, it was rumored that the judge in the case began wearing a revolver on his person beneath his robes for protection. On November 16th, the prosecution rested their case. 3 days later, the defense stunned the court by resting as well, after not calling a single witness. Shouting their disapproval, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten demanded to testify. However, the defense, knowing their ultimate dedication to Manson and the fact that they were willing to completely take accountability for the murders in order to free their leader, rested their case prematurely in an effort to keep them from self-sabotaging their own case. Speaking about the trial in a 1987 interview, Patricia Krenwinkel stated, quote, "The entire proceedings were scripted by Charlie," unquote. And Charlie would finally get his say the next day in court. During his testimony, the jury was removed from the courtroom in order to prevent him from influencing them by implicating his co-defendants. Speaking for more than an hour, Manson would ramble about many things, including stating that, quote, "The music is telling the youth to rise up against the establishment," unquote. He also said, quote, "Why blame it on me? I didn't write the music." And, "To be honest with you, I don't recall ever saying, get a knife and a change of clothes and go do what Tex says." But it proved to be too little, too late. On January 25th, 1971, the jury returned guilty verdicts for all defendants in the case on each of the 27 separate counts against them. It was recommended that each of them face the death penalty for their crimes, but even conviction wouldn't be the end of the story. As the heart of the trial concluded and closing arguments were pending, one of the defense attorneys who Manson had taken particular dislike against, Ronald Hughes, went missing during a weekend camping trip. Ominously, Manson had looked at Hughes at one point during the trial after he had refused to allow his clients to self-sabotage themselves to save their leader and stated, quote, "I don't want to see you in the courtroom again," unquote. And he wasn't. On March 29, 1971, the same day that the jury returned death penalty verdicts on all the defendants on all counts, Hughes's badly decomposed body was found wedged between two boulders in a gorge. Due to the advanced decomposition on the body, a cause of death was unable to be determined, but it is widely thought that Hughes was yet another victim of the family, who were still carrying out their leader's twisted wishes. The death penalty for all the Manson family defendants was eventually reduced to life in prison due to the court ruling in 1972, which declared the death penalty unconstitutional. Each of the defendants were eligible then for parole. Eventually, all the convicted members would renounce Manson, and many of them would show remorse in their later years. Susan Atkins served a life sentence at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, California. In 2008, it was announced that she was suffering from brain cancer. An application for compassionate release due to her health status was denied in July, and she was denied parole for the 18th and final time in September 2009. Susan Atkins died of natural causes 22 days later. She was 61 years old. Patricia Krenwinkel is still serving her life sentence at the California Institution for Women at Chino, California. She has been denied parole a total of 14 times. Leslie Van Houten is housed at the California Institution for Women in Frontera, California, where she is serving her sentence. As of 2018, she has been denied parole a total of 21 times. Charles Tex Watson is serving his life sentence at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego, California. He is now an ordained minister and claims to be a born-again Christian. He has been denied parole 17 times. Bobby Beausoleil, killer of Gary Hinman and former family member, began serving a 30-plus year sentence in 1970. He is still serving his sentence at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, California. Linda Kasabian was granted immunity for being the key prosecution witness during the trial and moved away from California afterwards. But what of the man who gave his name to perhaps the most infamous cult of all time? Charles Manson was imprisoned at Corcoran State Prison and was denied parole a total of 12 times. On January 1st, 2018, he was taken to the hospital and found to be suffering from gastrointestinal bleeding. He was returned to prison, still very ill. On November 15th, he was returned to the hospital and only 4 days later died from cardiac arrest resulting from complications from colon cancer. He was 83 years old. The Tate residence was eventually demolished and a new mansion was built on the property. The home remains vacant. The La Bianca home is a private residence and was placed on the market in 2019 when it was purchased by Ghost Adventures host and true crime fan Zach Bagans. He had reportedly planned on using the property for an upcoming production, but, quote, changed his mind when he felt the vibe there. He has placed the home back on the market, telling TMZ that he ultimately decided to abandon whatever project he was working on out of respect for the surviving members of the La Bianca family. The final legacy of the Manson family and the motivation for the crimes is up for debate to this day, but two things are certain. America was never the same after those fateful bloody nights in August of 1969. Second, more than anything else in his life, the little boy from the hills of West Virginia wanted to be famous, and ultimately he got his wish. 40 years after the crimes, during a retrospective from the Los Angeles Times, former family member and ranch worker Juan Flynn had perhaps the most appropriate parting words. Quote, Charles Manson got away with everything. People will say he's in jail, but Charlie is exactly where he wants to be.